The Scottish Bowl is the biggest tournament in fantasy football, and this year I finished third, which is the greatest achievement I've had since I've been playing fantasy football. In this video, I'm going to tell you how I did it. I'm going to tell you about the one moment that nearly won it for me right at the beginning, and the moment that cost me that win. Let's get into it. If this is your first time visiting my channel, thank you so much. My name is Lewis, aka Fancy Pancake, and I just finished third in SFB14. But to start off with, if you don't know, what is SFB? So SFB started by Scott Fish, who I chatted with last night, of Fancy Cares and the creator of Devi Leagues, also runs Safe Leagues. One of the nicest guys in fantasy football, has raised a ridiculous amount for charity with the Scott Fish Bowl, this obviously being the 14th year. It is the biggest tournament in fantasy football, so just under 4,000 people from all over the world, as you can tell hearing from my accent, all over the world, compete for the huge prize of being the Scott Fish Bowl winner. It is just prestige and honour that you get from winning. There is no monetary value, as this is a charity competition. This comprises of fans, analysts, and celebrities. Basically, whoever you are listening to, whoever you are watching to get your fantasy football advice from, they are competing in Scott Fish Bowl, and I beat nearly all of them. Each year for Scott Fish Bowl, Scott produces a weird and wonderful set of rules, and you can see this year's to the left-hand side of me. I remember there was the stream where Scott will announce the rules, and everyone's always very excited. He does lots of different things every year to keep it fresh, and this year people were theorizing about what it could be. So if you'll take a look, you can see everything's elevated a little bit. There's a bonus for first downs, there's a double reception bonus for tight ends. It's 6-point passing touchdowns for quarterbacks. There's even a small 0.25 points for rushing attempts. So it seemed like rushing was going to be a big thing, potentially looking at those dual threat quarterbacks to score the most points, but also running backs being huge. Then, if you look at the bottom of that list, you can see the most important thing, which was return yards. Yeah, that's right. For the first year, Scott was offering points for return yards for both punts and kickoffs. This was going to be the thing that was going to shape Scott Fish Bowl for this year. Now, this was a really interesting thing to me, and I'm going to touch upon this a little later on. But to me, returners were the hardest thing to predict. I have been playing fantasy football for a long old time now, and I know what I'm doing with the other positions. Returners, the teams don't even know who's going to be returning kicks and punts for them until training camp. So this was an incredibly hard thing to predict, and I will share my strategy with you as I start to talk about the draft. As I've mentioned, Scott Fish Bowl is an incredibly competitive competition, and it is just as competitive to try and get into it in the first place. So one of the ways that you can do so is to enter into a live draft. These run all over the world at this point, and I was really lucky to be invited to compete in the live draft in London in July last year at the United Kingdom Fantasy Football Convention, which is run by some friends of mine and is a really fantastic growing event. If you are watching this in the UK and you haven't heard about this, please keep your eyes peeled. I'll talk about it later in the next few months when we announce the next date, but it is such a fantastic event. This was the first time I'd ever done a live draft before, and that's not just thinking about Scott Fish Bowl, that's thinking about live drafts in general. Now, back in the day, this was the way that people would have played fantasy football. You gathered on a night, you all sat round with your picks, or you wrote on a draft board, but these days we do them on Sleeper, we do them on MFL, we do them on Yahoo if we're still living 10 years ago. So I wasn't really entirely sure what this would look like. So I want to talk you through my preparations a little bit. And I think everyone on the night prepared a lot. I think I was probably one of the, not say one of the least prepared, but probably one of the less scripted in the way that I'm going to do things. So the things that I did, and I'll flash them up on the screen now so you can take a look. I was very lucky to have a value over replacement player or VORP guide from Rich Cooling, Dynasty Island on Twitter, and part of the Fancy Sanctuary, who are going to be a recurring theme of this video. This shows you the players that obviously have the most added value over a replacement level player, so the players that are going to really stand out at their position, which I printed off and I brought with me. I also was able to get the most up-to-date live draft ADP. Live drafts do work very differently. You can suddenly get a few changes, and if people, their phone suddenly dies and they don't have ADP in front of them, on Sleeper it's quite easy when you've got the next player in front of you. But players can sort of slip through the cracks a little bit at a live draft if people just don't notice the sticker is still there. And that did happen with a couple of players, actually. So I had the ADP in front of me so that I knew exactly what players should be going where. Then the two things that I made myself. I went through all 32 teams, and I did it division by division, and I created a stack chart. So in tournaments like this, you can get a huge amount of additional value by stacking, especially when it comes to the playoffs, which is obviously a tournament style format. And the theory being that you then have to rely on less outcomes, which gives you a higher ceiling and a higher floor. So by getting a quarterback and a wide receiver, you're then able to, get both of those points when they score touchdowns, which later down the line, this is a DFS and best ball tactic, is going to be incredibly valuable. So I created a stack chart for every single team in the NFL for the main players that I wanted to get with their ADPs in front of them, so that I could know, okay, if I've gone this way and I need to target them, I know I'm picking here, so I'm going to take them either around early, or I probably can wait for my pick and get them there. The next thing that I did was I had a almost flowchart type for the first 4 rounds of the draft. Now, this was intentional. It was a 20-round draft, but I didn't want to plan through all 20 rounds. I wanted to make sure that I could be flexible with my approach and see how I wanted things to go based off what was happening in front of me. So really relaxing and letting the draft come to me, which I think is the best way to draft. You often find yourself reaching if you're overly planned and then you're not actually paying attention to what's in front of you. One of the things I wanted to do this whole time was actually be able to look and see, well, how are other people drafting? How can I react to this? Which players are going to go where? The ADP is very useful, but sometimes players slip and you have to pivot. And that is exactly what happened. So I decided to pick at the 105. I actually was the last person in the division. So I didn't really get a chance on the 105. I just took what was in front of me. And I had spent the entire last couple of months before the draft thinking about what I wanted to do there. The consensus ADP at the time was the first 4 picks were any combination of Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, and Christian McCaffrey. So the debate of the 105 was Patrick Mahomes, Anthony Richardson, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill. Now the season's over, you know that none of those players did particularly well. And I had spent ages thinking, this is a ceiling tournament. So what am I going to do at the 105? And I think I decided on Anthony Richardson with the highest ceiling outcome of potentially any player in fantasy football, which, looking back in hindsight, he was benched midway through the season and not very good for the rest of it. But there I was going into the night confident that Anthony Richardson was the way I was going to go at the 105. Tenterhooks, I know, very intentional to pause and leave you there to see what I actually did at the 105. If this is your first time watching my channel, or if you have joined me for this video and you are not subscribed, I would please encourage you to do so. I am a relatively new YouTuber. I've only been running this YouTube for about 3 months. This was my first season and I have loved every single minute, but there is going to be so much content this off season. Dynasty, even looking at early redraft rankings, looking at the rookie class. There is already my initial rookie rankings video on my channel. And if you don't want to hear from the guy who finished 3rd in Scott Fishbowl this year, well, I guess you probably want to hear from the guys who finished 1st and 2nd, but I don't think they have YouTube channels, so it's me that you're stuck with. But let's find out who I ended up taking at the 105. So the live draft gets going, and these are my league mates. And just to start off by saying thank you so much to all of them for the night. It was so much fun, and I was so glad to be able to draft with them. So we kick off. 101 is Josh Allen. That is exactly as we expect. 102, Christian McCaffrey. Again, any combination of these players there is what we're thinking. Then 103 comes around, and I'm thinking Hurts and Lamar go. Anthony Richardson, that's the way I'm going to go. The 103 goes on the board, and it's Patrick Mahomes, which means Jalen Hurts goes at the 104, and Lamar Jackson, who I would argue potentially could be the 101 in this format, finds himself falling all the way to me at the 105. I am absolutely buzzing, but I have to find a way to not kind of give this off already. The draft board then loops itself around. My plans immediately start to go out of the window. I am planning to take Mark Andrews when the board comes back. Well, I end up with, first of all, on the way back round, I look towards Jahmyr Gibbs because I think this is probably the best value looking in the second round where I'm picking. Then as we go to third round reversal, I am looking at Mark Andrews. I'm looking at that stack and he goes 3 picks ahead of me. But another tight end slips all the way to me, and that is Trey McBride, who was projected to go as the tight end 3, but ultimately finished as the tight end 1. So you can see how by playing the board in front of me, by playing the draft game, I was able to snag some huge values. And in the end, everything ended up working out really well. I was the second latest Stephon Diggs drafter because people just weren't paying attention to him because he's older. And then when you look at some of the values that I was able to snag later on, I was able to get Brian Thomas Jr., who we know had an unbelievable rookie season. I was able to get him as my wide receiver 4, and I was able to draft him in, I believe, the 7th or 8th round. And then Bucky Irving all the way down in the 18th round, which was unbelievable for a player that ended up finishing as the running back 14. So the tactic that I took was to ignore returners, right? I wasn't taking a single returner because I didn't trust them. But what I was going to do is I was going to take players later on who I thought might have some return upside. So players who were going to have a role on the offense, but might also end up returning kicks. And this was the case with Bucky Irving. This was the case with Jalen Warren. And I actually didn't have a single other returner on my roster, but it clearly worked out all right in the end. So here is the team that I ended up leaving the night with, and I'm not going to lie, I left feeling absolutely delighted. I had youth at the running back position and some absolute bell cows. I had some real upside in rookies, and I left with 3 veteran wide receivers who I felt like were really going to anchor my team, as well as a couple of stacks. So at the quarterback position, Lamar Jackson, Baker Mayfield, Baker, probably the best pick that I made, including Lamar, including Trey McBride. Getting Baker in the 7th was, in the 5th, was absolutely unbelievable. He finished as a top 5 quarterback on the season and was unbelievable. Then at the running back position, the big picks, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, Tony Pollard, Jalen Warren, and late down the board, Bucky Irving, which was absolutely huge for me. Then at the wide receiver position, Cooper Kupp, Mike Evans, Stephon Diggs, and of course, I ended up with Brian Thomas Jr., probably the other best pick that I made. At the tight end position, I ended up with Trey McBride, and I ended up much, much later on down the board with Noah Fant, which didn't go hugely well, but he was a big part of the team, and Cade Otton, who actually was a huge part of the team for quite a while Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were out. So you can see there's a fair few stacks there. Russell Wilson to Jalen Warren, and then a ridiculous Baker Mayfield stack, which was made even better when I ended up claiming Jalen McMillan off waivers, who is a player that I'm going to come back to for an annoying reason a little bit later on, but ended up with a huge Bucks stack. The other big player that I ended up getting off waivers was Taysom Hill, which we know had a huge, huge impact in 1 week later on down the season. So this was one of the only times where I was absolutely delighted with the team that I had after the draft, and it actually ended up going pretty well off the back of that. Normally it's the other way around, but I was delighted walking away from that night. I'm not going to talk you through each week of the regular season, but as you can see from the results on the screen here, I think I knew pretty early on that I was onto something that had a chance. But the Scott Fish Bowl is such a hard tournament that I knew it was going to be difficult. You can get to the playoffs based off records. You can get to the playoffs based off points. I got there based off both. You can get there on finish as well. But I was in the top 100 from week one, and I only dropped out for 1 week the entire time, including getting to the playoffs with one of the best averages. So for Scott Fish Bowl, you get your regular season average added to your score. So obviously the better you perform in the regular season, the more likely you are to succeed in playoffs. My lineup was also setting itself. I obviously suffered with injuries later on, with Cup struggling, with Stefan Diggs struggling, but Brian Thomas Jr. obviously stepped in. And my lineup was reasonably easy to set from there, with Tony Pollard really thriving in the early stages of the season as well, and Lamar and Baker looking like an unbeatable combination at the quarterback position. So even very early on in the season, I knew that something special might be about to happen. So then we hit playoffs, and playoffs in Scott Fish Bowl are really, really hard once you're in there. So the top 2,000 get through to that initial week. Then you lose 500, 500, 500, and finally down to the final 50 for that last round of playoffs. I smashed through the first few weeks and was absolutely delighted. Was never really in doubt. I was sort of top 10, top 15 the entire way, and really starting to get that thinking of something might be happening here. And then in the semi-finals, I went to bed with my team absolutely falling to pieces. There was no way that I thought I was going to get into that top 50. Everyone was struggling, particularly Cooper Kupp and Trey McBride. But by the time I wake up in the morning, they've both had 30-point second halves, and I find myself in the top 50 and in the final of Scott Fish Bowl. And not only that, you get half of your average added to your score. And I was going into the final week with the highest average of any team. So I'm really starting to think that this might be doable. So then the final, and unfortunately, you do know how this story ends. I don't win Scott Fish Bowl. At the end, I end up losing by 18 points and finishing third, finishing as the top entrant from the UK, which is absolutely unbelievable. And I was really delighted with this finish. One of the issues that I had, so when I was setting my lineup, Cooper Kupp had had a really disappointing few weeks beforehand, and I debated throwing in Jalen McMillan, treating it like a DFS slate where you're basically looking for a mega stack for the highest ceiling upside. I messaged this question into the Fantasy Sanctuary Discord. Tom Strachan, maybe the brightest DFS best ball mind in the UK, comes back and says, Jalen McMillan is the ceiling play. Like, it's riskier, it's a lower floor, but that's the way that you should go. And in the end, I'm a coward. I can't bring myself to do it. I start Cooper Kupp. I'm a Rams fan, and I can't have Cooper Kupp go off on my bench and be the reason that costs me Scott Fish Bowl. But in the end, it is the opposite. Jalen McMillan scores 24 points. Cooper Kupp scores 4, and I lose by 18. But with that in mind, I don't know about the lineup decisions that the other people in the final made, and I ended up losing to a much, much deserving winner in Chris Charles, who I've spoken with and congratulated, and I'm so, so proud of him as well. I ended up staying until 4 o'clock in the morning, including jumping on a stream with Scott Fish Bowl that hopefully a few of you might have caught, to talk about how things are going. And during that stream, you can watch me getting incredibly irate as Deebo Samuel continues to be the reason why I don't win Scott Fish Bowl with over 100 return yards. And in the end, I think it's only fair that with this strange format, with this strange scoring, the reason that the guy won in the end was because of special teams. It was because of return yards. The thing that I never engaged with, I started a returner once, and that was it, in Amir Abdullah. The thing that I decided to actively ignore was the reason that I didn't win Scott Fish Bowl. But I am so, so proud of the journey, finishing third out of 4,000 people and the top entrant from my country, and coming so close to that win. I wish I could have done it, but the support I've got has been absolutely incredible for just making it to this point. So, to close us off, what did I learn from this, and what can you take into charity tournaments and fancy football leagues next year? The first thing is the importance of good preparation. You saw the amount that I did to prepare for this draft, and it really led me well. Now, obviously, a live draft is slightly different, but if you're doing that next year, I can absolutely recommend and I can send over the templates for all of the things that I used if you're interested. But for any fancy football league, you need to know the format and you need to go in with a guide for the way that you want the draft to fall. But at the same time, don't prepare too much. Let the draft come to you. If I hadn't done that, if I'd done differently, I wouldn't have ended up with Brian Thomas Jr., who was one of the reasons that I ended up doing so well. The second thing, if you're playing in Scott Fishbowl next year, please go to a live draft. They are so strange, but without the ADP in front of you, all values are thrown out of the window. So it's way easier to come away with a team that you're really happy with. Also, the atmosphere is so much fun. I will do it as long as I am able to hang out with a group of people, whether they're friends or people you're meeting for the first time, and just rib each other, congratulate each other's picks, discuss fancy football. It is so much fun. The other thing I would say is you need to stack. You need to be looking at stacks, whether they're just simple quarterback to wide receivers or looking into the finals and treating them like a DFS slate and looking at those mega stacks for those highest ceiling gains. I wouldn't have done anywhere near as well as I did without the Bucks on my team. So looking into high-powered offenses that you can get cheap. If it's a super flex format, you need to be looking at those quarterbacks later on that have a chance to explode. That is something I would absolutely recommend. And the final thing that I learned is just how amazing the fantasy football community is. I've had lots of people messaging me over the last few days. I think because I'm a content creator, so I talked a lot about my journey across Twitter and on YouTube. And they've been messaging me saying, I was really rooting for you. I've been following this the whole time. Like, I woke up and I checked whether or not you'd won before I checked if I'd won my own championship. It is incredible. The UK scene is a huge, huge part of that. And I felt very supported by everyone in the UK. But across everyone paying attention to Scott Fishbowl, I've been so grateful for the support that I've seen in the past few weeks. I'm sorry that I couldn't quite get over the line, but thank you so much for supporting me across this journey. I just want to finish with a set of thank yous. First of all, they're not watching this, but thank you to all of my players. They absolutely smashed it this year. A huge thank you to Scott Fish and to the entire Scott Fishbowl and Fancy Cares team. What you do is incredible. The format and the competition is so much fun, and I had so much fun chatting with you last night as well. To my Fancy Wildcard crew, to the Rewind crew for supporting me all of the way through. It has been so felt. To the Fancy Sanctuary Discord, particularly to Subfictional Rich Bilkey for all of the work that he's done on returners analysis. Again, the support has been so felt for the past few weeks, so I'm so grateful. And finally, to you, the person watching this, whether you're just tuning into the channel for the first time or whether you follow me on Twitter and you've engaged with the journey, I felt such a swell of support from the fancy football community, and that includes you. So thank you so much for watching. I will hopefully be back in Scott Fishbowl next year and hopefully can improve on my finish. And hopefully that means first and not finishing second. If I finish second next year, I'll be absolutely gutted if I can't go all the way. But fancy football is a strange and cruel mistress. If you have enjoyed this video, I would please like to ask you to consider liking and subscribing. There's going to be so much content in this off season. Please feel free to drop a comment down below and tell me about your journey in Scott Fishbowl or any questions that you might have about how I managed to finish third. I hope you won your championships. I hope you are rolling in money. Thank you so much. Happy New Year, because I'm recording this on New Year's Eve, and I will see you in 2025 for so much rookie content. It's dynasty season, guys. Take care.